Welcome to the Training Ground Guru podcast in association with Genius Sports. In every episode, we bring you insights into the teams behind the teams in professional football. Coming up on today's episode.
If you're trying to coach an athlete, a player, on what they were doing wrong or a different decision they could be making, it's often much more effective to kind of go into the 3D world and show them what it felt like to be on the pitch, because while we all watch the game from that kind of midfield camera one view, that's not the way a player experiences the game at all, right? And so if you can actually show them and speak to them in their own language, I think we've seen that become a really potent tool for some Premier League clubs.
I'm Simon Austin from Training Ground Guru, and our guest on this episode is Michael D'Auria. Michael is the EVP of Partnerships, Sports and Technology for Genius Sports and has been at the cutting edge of tracking data development for more than a decade. He explained to me why this data has revolutionised data analytics in football and where it's headed next. After that, we have a bonus interview with Dominic Jordan, the former Director of Data at Manchester United, now with 12 Football. Dom told us exactly how clubs like United deploy this tracking data. We hope you enjoy this episode, and if you do, please give us a follow via your preferred podcast provider. Thank you very much for joining us on the podcast, Mike.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, the topic of this podcast is the past, present, and future of tracking data. And I know this is something that you've been involved in for a long time. So I thought, could we just start by giving a definition of tracking data, what it is for people who might not know?
Yeah, tracking data is a type of technology or a class of technology that's really trying to better and better capture the live action that's going on a football pitch or anywhere in sport. You know, generally when we talk about it now, we refer to optical tracking data. So that's, you know, a set of cameras installed in a stadium that are using computer vision to translate the live action on the pitch into as robust a real-time data representation of the game as possible. And, you know, as we can kind of get into how this has evolved, but we really think the state-of-the-art technology now allows you to essentially create a real-time digital twin or kind of digital replica of what's going on in the game. And that kind of opens up all types of exciting downstream possibilities for products, services, and just kind of having a better understanding of the game.
And it's called tracking data because it's tracking the movements of every player in the ball.
That's right, at a really high level of precision. So now we can kind of track thousands of data points on the surface of every player in the ball, hundreds of times a second. And if you think about that, over the course of a 90-minute football match, you're getting up to billions of data points to represent what's going on the pitch. And so that's really where the tracking came from. When we started, you were just trying to track the center of mass of a player kind of projected down onto the pitch in 2 dimensions. But as we've gotten better and kind of AI has continued to evolve, we've really just been able to get a much more granular representation of football.
And your title now, Executive Vice President, Partnerships, Sports and Technology for Genius Sports. But I know prior to this, you had a decade with Second Spectrum, who were bought by Genius. I mean, you've been involved with tracking data then, I guess, for a long time, you know, almost as long as anyone, really.
Yeah, really about when tracking data came into sports. You know, so this kind of type of computer vision technology has been around in different areas for a really long time. But the reason Second Spectrum was kind of founded was a much earlier version of this system had just been introduced to the NBA. It wasn't even league-wide, but it existed at a couple different NBA venues. And folks in the NBA ecosystem started to really get excited about the possibilities that this could bring and how it could improve tactical analysis and how the game is coached and played. But the challenge at that time was it was a huge amount of data, and most NBA teams didn't staff up teams of engineers. And so we brought this combination of kind of athletes and kind of cutting edge engineers into the space to say, we can help you take this tracking data and turn it into something that's going to be valuable for you as a coach, as a general manager, ultimately as a fan. And that was kind of where we've existed for throughout our whole time, even post acquisition by Genius Sports, is how do we create the best tracking data and then use it to kind of create more value in the sports ecosystem. Again, whether it's a coach, a fan, a broadcaster, a player, we think there's something to be delivered for everybody there.
So in the early days of Second Spectrum with the NBA, it was using cameras, optical tracking, was it, that you were capturing this data?
That's right. And even initially, it wasn't us. It was a different company that was using an earlier version of this technology to put in cameras and capture the data. And back then, it was a single data point per player 25 times a second. And the data was delivered to you really the next morning, some number of hours after the game. And so over time, the systems have gotten much more mature, and they can both capture a huge amount more data, but they can also do it in real time in less than a second now. And so it's just become much more valuable because you have a better representation, and you can do it really in the live environment as well, not just post-match.
And how would this data then be relayed to the teams and the users after the match?
So the real value that I think we bring is to say, we can deliver this tracking data for you. Then we can also apply another layer of real-time AI to that to basically translate that tracking data into we would think about the language of sport. And so that could be basic things in basketball or football, shots and passes. That could be, in basketball, one of the early pieces of value we added was classifying all the pick and rolls that happened in a game and on all the types of defenses that a team could play against them. And it could be things that go beyond what a human can measure, like shot probability or expected pass completion. And so in football now, you can take that tracking data and you can kind of instantly have, hundreds of new football metrics that maybe fans and coaches have always wanted to talk about: pressing and pressure and between the lines passes and overlapping runs, things that are happening on the ball, things that are happening off the ball. And you can deliver this much more robust and kind of complicated language of football all in real time.
And just going back to the past again, which is really interesting to inform where we are now, did this really revolutionise data science then? Did it just give a much greater breadth of data than teams had previously?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what it really did was it kind of unlocked a new era of how data could be used to inform sports. And so you really saw this in the NBA over the past decade of all 30 NBA teams' workflows now are totally reliant on this data. When they're using it in every way, they make a decision about how to prepare for a game and how to defend the team they're playing that night, to how do they value a player when they're making a trade or acquiring somebody in free agency. And it kind of went from this type of information, this level of information just didn't exist in sport. And so when it came, whenever you have this new layer of data, and we've seen this happen in every other industry really, right? It was just sport was actually a bit late to adopt some of this technology because it's hard, it's live, it's dynamic. But when this data came, it really, I think, in my opinion, laid the foundation to totally transform how teams use the data. But ultimately now what we're seeing too, how media and fans interact with the game as well.
And had it actually originated in the military? I think I read that somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think some of this computer vision technology was from things like missile defense systems. Those are some of the early applications of it. But it's the same type of technology that you see in self-driving cars and in lots of other applications now, right? It's really using cameras and different kind of sensors to just try to get the best representation of the real world that you can. And, for our specific application, we're applying it to sport.
When did soccer or football start to use tracking data and collect tracking data?
Football was on a similar time frame. I think, you started to see individual clubs dabble with this about 10 years ago as well. I think it maybe started a bit later than the NBA. And then kind of as a company, as a business, we really kind of earnestly made the transition from being just a basketball company to working in football via our partnership with the Premier League about 6 or 7 years ago now.
And looking at that partnership with the Premier League then, how does that work? How do you capture tracking data at a Premier League game at a stadium on a Saturday afternoon? So
right now, every Premier League ground and actually every championship ground too has our optical tracking system installed. So at a Premier League ground, you're going to have about 28 or 30 cameras deployed throughout the stadium. We actually use a smartphone as the kind of core unit of our system. There's 28 or 30 iPhones at every Premier League ground that are capturing data real time for what's going on in a game. And I think the Premier League has been a great example of like how this data that you can capture can kind of touch every part of the football ecosystem, where all of the clubs use this data on a day in and day out basis to, again, evaluate players, figure out strategy, help their manager, be informed about what's going on in the game. The media uses it as well. On once a week, Premier League Productions puts out something called Data Zone that is a kind of uses data and video augmentation to have a much different presentation of the game. Sky Sports are huge users of our data from an editorial perspective to kind of tell deeper stories about what's going on. And then this year, you may have seen that we've launched semi-automated offside technology, which is powered by the exact same data. And so you're now kind of moving into the world of impacting officiating of the game as well. And so this is where we think there's a lot of power when you can capture really high quality data in real time, when you can use that AI to translate it into, football language that someone's going to care about. Again, whether you're a club or whether you're official, you can really bring a lot of improvement to the game. And that's kind of what we're after.
So there's 28 cameras, are there, that are linked to 28 smartphones?
No, so we actually use the camera on the smartphone, right? So it's it sounds a little bit interesting, but like one of the things about phones these days is, over the last decade or so, they've had billions and billions of dollars of investment put into them. It's a very competitive market if you're selling smartphones, and the cameras, as you probably have noticed, just keep getting better and better with every evolution of the phone. And so, we can capture up to 200 frames per second on the iPhone, and you can kind of really be, because it's a small unit that you can kind of point basically wherever you want, you can really have a lot of focus on certain areas of the pitch where you might need more coverage. And because they're relatively cost effective and they're, again, easy to mount places, you can really scale up or scale down the numbers of phones that you need. And so we think it's going to be a really the right system for the future, whereas even if new use cases come online, it's not so hard for us to go back to a stadium and add another 4, 5, 6, 7 phones.
Whereabouts are they positioned in the stadium?
We tend to put them up pretty high and try to tuck them away in, the rafters or in the higher parts of the stadium. I mean, every ground is a little bit different. And so, I mean, we're pretty creative about where we can fix them. Again, they're small units. They just come in a bit of a weatherproofed housing and can kind of be affixed to just about any part of stadium infrastructure. But we generally try to just get as good of coverage as we can all the way around the pitch, because for us, it's really about having as many high quality angles of the pitch as possible to make sure that in any given moment you have multiple cameras kind of pointed at every part of the pitch.
And how is that data then fed to the team and to the staff, sort of as the game is ongoing, as it's live?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways. You can automate a tactical view that a lot of analysts use out of a couple of those phones, so you can deliver just the raw video. The most common way this happens is, we'll process that video into tracking data, and we'll provide that as an API to clubs. And then we'll have another layer of processing that turns it into that, again, that language of football. So that more kind of tactical analysis, not just, where was my right ankle for this, 1/100th of a second, but actually no, this was a particular football action. That's also delivered as a separate data API that clubs can consume. And this all goes into a software tool that we produce for them that can further help them kind of process this data in a live environment. So we'll have a live fitness tracker to help them manage substitutions and understand if players are getting a bit fatigued. It will allow them to kind of chart data that they might want to be looking at over the course of a game. It will allow them to kind of query the data and precisely index it to video. So if you want to look at every time your left back made an overlapping run and joined the attack, in this game, you can very quickly pull up the video playlist of all those moments. But it's really using it to try to just help video analysts and data analysts surface content, whether it's data, video, or visualizations, in a kind of the most bespoke way they can.
Would there actually be a data scientist who would be getting the raw data live on a match day? Is that a use of it?
Absolutely right. Yeah, most clubs now have somebody who works in data science or a similar profession who their job is to connect to the live streams of this data in video, power it through whatever internal systems the particular club has, and use it as a way to, again, evaluate how they're performing in the match, or get ready for some reports to give to the manager at halftime, or just kind of as a post-game analysis. And we try to be, we're pretty tightly integrated with all those clubs, just to try to make sure that's happening as smoothly as possible.
And how would they receive that data? Is it on for a layman, is it on a spreadsheet or something like that?
Yeah, so they're generally taking in a data API that might power an internal report that they've constructed for their club or their manager. A lot of the work does happen through our software tool where we can help them process it and they can preset some things on the software tool. So you can kind of imagine that you have a dashboard and you're getting alerts about whatever things you might particularly care about during the match. And, a huge part of football coaching and football analysis is video analysis. It's a lot of the ways that the actual message finally gets translated down to players. So a lot of this just helps them really quickly and really efficiently or fully automatically cut up video into a playlist so that you can say, so that a manager can just know at halftime he's going to be able to walk in and have the 7 video clips of when their club was not performing the way they wanted to or showing something that their opponent's doing that they need to respond to. And I think it's a way that we can just really help clubs do that faster and more automatically.
And we're used now to seeing often the assistant on the bench with their tablet sat next to the manager. We're often not sure entirely what they're doing really or what they're looking at. But would your data be feeding what they're seeing on that tablet?
Very often, yes. So very often our data will be powering some sort of report that they want to be looking at or some sort of tracking of what was going on during the action. The greatest managers, right, have a really good eye test. They can watch a game of football and just get a handle of what's going on everywhere on the pitch and kind of into it because they've watched so much of the game before. What we can really do is just kind of give them a superpower to be able to doing that with this AI everywhere, right? So something that they might be missing or something that maybe is allows them to focus on a different part of the game. And so we try to really just be, like a manager and assistant manager's superpowers to be able to do that at a much grander scale.
And I remember we had a piece with Will Spearman, who's now the head of analytics at Liverpool, as you probably know, fellow American.
Yep.
And he was talking about assessing space live on the tablet during a game. I think he said at that time you couldn't do it because there was a delay between when the data, when it happened and when it came through. But is that something that they're doing now, do you know, assessing space?
Yeah, absolutely. It's, it's one of the great things about football, right? Is that it's such a geometric game where space matters so much. And it's also one of the ways that technology has really evolved. Like when Will started at Liverpool, I can't remember exactly when that was, but there was probably a number of seconds or even minutes of latency in the data feed. Now we're delivering it in less than a second. And so there's really no difference from if you're looking at an iPad or a device from by the time you look down and look back at the pitch, you can't discern the difference. And so it's one of these great things that we can do. We can very precisely measure exactly where every player is, exactly where the ball is. And so by default, how much space they are kind of occupying or how much pitch control they might have, depending on how people are moving. And we can represent that to an analyst. And that's something that, again, a great manager might get a feel for, but we can actually mathematically measure it now and kind of give you both a real-time view of it and a report of how that has changed and evolved over the course of a half or 90 minutes of football.
Oh, wow. So that is something that Premier League teams would be assessing live on the bench as the game's going on.
That's right.
Oh, wow. Fantastic. We've covered Liverpool a lot, actually, on the history of our website, because they've been the real market leaders in data science, and that's given them a real advantage over the years. And I can remember some of the guys like Will talking about the tracking data, saying it had really revolutionised what they do, because previously it was event data they looked at, so it might be number of shots or crosses or possession. But this has just given so much more depth in what they can do, as you say. And we are seeing some geniuses coming in, aren't we? Physicists and so on. I think he'd worked on the Higgs boson previously.
That's right. I always enjoyed visiting Liverpool because I had an engineering background. I went to MIT many years ago, and they had the most physicists I'd ever seen employed by a football team. But it was really a good fit because I think the way that a physicist models 3D interactions in the real world actually has a lot of parallels between the type of data that we're trying to capture on a football match now. We refer to it as spatiotemporal data, right? It's data about how physical objects move through space and time. And so there are quite a few parallels in that kind of core level of tracking data and the way that physicists model interactions in the real world.
And is the potential kind of endless, really, with what you can do with this? Because I'm guessing, again, a key use is in recruitment of players and also managers. So what kind of level of depth could you get in assessing a player? Can you look at their physical attributes and outputs, technical, tactical?
Yeah, the great part about the system is once it's installed, there's really no limit to the kind of ways you can evaluate a player, an individual, or a team. Like you said, you can get precise information about their physical attributes. How fast are they running? How fast is their acceleration, their deceleration? How much do they fatigue? At what points in the match? How do they perform under fatigue? You can get now, because you have the kind of full 3D body modeled so well, you can get into their technique, right? So you can really understand, how does their leg swing when they are kind of trying to bend across in from the wing, and how high can they get up when they're trying to head a ball into the back of the net, and kind of really understand that dynamical way their body moves. A lot of this stuff wasn't possible before, but for years people would do an analysis on, how many times a midfielder might, have a head swivel to kind of be checking for space as he's receiving a pass and getting ready to distribute. And like all of these things become things that you can now scientifically, mathematically model. You can look at the likelihood that a player is going to complete a pass and how they actually do perform against that. And like you said, I think recruiting is probably the next big frontier here, right? Like we have really great coverage across English football and the Premier League and the Championship. And one of the big things we hope to do is just expand the number of leagues where this type of tracking system exists, right? And so using phones, it was one of the real design principles behind our newest tracking system, where we can go to 28, 38, 50 phones in a Premier League ground, but you can also scale that down. So if you get to smaller leagues that are a bit more resource constrained, we can still have that same core tracking system deployed for them, or as you go down the pyramid in an individual country, lower and lower. And so a lot of what we're spending our time on now is trying to promote getting this system out to just more places where significant football is played, because we think that will both democratize a lot of these tools that we think are really supportive for leagues, but will kind of generally help the whole industry if there's that level of data sharing. It's when we started in the Premier League, actually, data wasn't even shared across all 380 matches, right? You would only get access to data for games that you played in. That's changed now. If you're a Premier League club, you get access to all 380 matches. And so we'd love to see a similar thing happen between leagues as well, where, between England and France, where we also work, and Belgium, where we also work, and Denmark, where we also work, we start to get a data exchange, and you can really look across all the different leagues and as you're going through your recruiting process.
Yeah, that has always seemed to be one shortcoming, really, the fact that there are different tracking data deals for all of the major leagues, I think. So if you're looking to sign a player from France, you can't see their tracking data, for example.
That's right. But I think, to me, the way the world has moved is data is becoming more and more portable, and we're becoming more and more comfortable sharing certain, maybe not all, but like some of this information. And so we certainly hope and support that there will be more cross-league sharing of data as we get into the future. We already know that some leagues have frameworks for this. Ultimately, of course, that's going to be a league-by-league decision, but we think there's kind of just more value for everybody if that starts to become more of the norm.
Is there actually movement on that then, Michael? Do you think we could see that happening pretty soon and moves being made there?
I think we will start to see that pretty soon. Yeah, I think as people have just gotten more and more comfortable with what this data is, what it can do, as we've seen the value of it in different parts of the football ecosystem. Yeah, I would expect that in the coming seasons we'll see, it won't be all at once, but I think we'll start to see that happening a bit more.
Yeah, because that's what's led to the emergence of the broadcast tracking, isn't it, really, to try and fill that gap, really?
That's right. It is an opportunity as a stopgap. I mean, broadcast tracking is never going to be as robust and as detailed as having a fixed set of cameras in a stadium that's just, based on the kind of physics of kind of occlusion and how many cameras you have. But that has been the reason the demand has been there for that, is because it is still a better data source in some instances than traditional manual event data capture.
And looking ahead to the future of tracking data, and I think you touched on it, could you tell us about the mesh tracking, the 3D tracking that you're developing?
Yeah, I mean, it's fully deployed in the Premier League, and I think this level of tracking data allows you to do a couple really important things. The first one is we felt like this was necessary for officiating, to really make a call on an offsides, right? I don't just want to have approximately where my center of mass is or approximately where my shoulder joint is. We felt like you really needed the full surface of a human body mapped, again, with thousands and thousands of data points per frame, because on some calls, it's going to be pretty obvious, but on a really tight call that's coming down to 1 centimeter, I both need to know with certainty the moment my foot struck the ball, right, the precise kick point, and then I need to know exactly where the kind of like curvature of my shoulder or thigh or whatever part of my body is being evaluated is with regards to the offside line. And, Premier League players and football players are all really impressive athletes, but they have different body shapes, right? And so like being able to kind of get that level of resolution is very important. And so I think it has allowed us to really push into the officiating space where we can have the most accurate calls and again do it in real time so that you're not interrupting the game for a fan. The second thing that I expect we'll really see is I think there's going to be this world of 3D recreations of football that kind of come to light for a fan and for coaches in the future, where if a phenomenal goal is scored, we're all used to having a highlight package, be put in front of us before the next kickoff happens of a couple different angles from wherever you have coverage in the stadium. But with these really realistic 3D recreations, you could instantly go into a first-person view to see what it felt like to be, Haaland as he was scoring that goal. Or you could go from the keeper's view, or you could travel the path as the ball. Like you can now watch and experience a game in this 3D environment that's getting hyper realistic, and we think that's going to increasingly be a really interesting way for a fan to watch the game. And we're actually already seeing it with football clubs, where if you're trying to coach an athlete, a player, on what they were doing wrong or a different decision they could be making, it's often much more effective to kind of go into the 3D world and show them what it felt like to be on the pitch, because while we all watch the game from that kind of midfield camera one view, that's not the way a player experiences the game at all, right? And so if you can actually show them and speak to them in that, in their own language, I think we've seen that become a really potent tool for some Premier League clubs.
I actually went into an academy analysis session a few years ago, and they were doing the team analysis, and they showed that camera one view on the monitor. And actually a young player put his hand up and he said, "That's all good, but that's not what I see when I'm on the pitch." It's easy to critique from that overhead, but that's not what the player's seeing.
It's exactly right. And so I think like the better you can show a player what they were actually experiencing on the pitch, the better you're going to be able to coach them. And I mean, it's funny, the same thing goes for a referee too, right? Sometimes it's really instructive to say, put yourself in the position of a linesman who's trying to call a close offside play way on the other side of the pitch, and just give a bit of a perspective of how challenging it is to make that call in real time. And it's something that we're doing on the officiating side as well to help, continue to improve referees' games as well.
Fantastic. And does the mesh tracking also produce a lot more data points then? Does it give the data scientists a lot more data?
That's right. So you kind of think about how tracking evolved. It was kind of one data point on each player 25 times a second. And then it kind of went up to, maybe 25 or 30 skeletal points, 25, maybe 50 times a second. So that's a pretty big, leap. Now you're going up to, 10,000 data points per player, hundreds of times a second. And so like the volume of data is just scaling up. And frankly, not every club needs that level of data or is going to instantly get value out of it. But there's kind of two ways you can look at it. Yes, absolutely, a club has more data to kind of consume and play with if they want to go down that route. The other thing is that we always try to do is say, well, we're still going to try to package that data up into products that are easy to consume so that you as the data analyst get more value, get more options, but don't necessarily need to process all that data. So the 3D recreation is a great example. We produce those in our software tool. And so an analyst can just go around and navigate the 3D world. They don't have to worry necessarily about the billions of data points that went into creating that, right? We can also give you tactical data points about how the physical bodies are moving in kind of human language rather than having to parse through, all these representations of, an ankle rotating through space. And so for the clubs that want to go down and do it on their own, great, they can have at it. And for the clubs that maybe that's a bit overwhelming for, we can help them turn it into kind of products and services that are more powerful than they were before.
So if you're a Liverpool, one of the most capable data science departments in world football, are these billions of data points giving you more precision, or do they actually give you more potential as well for the insights that you can get?
I think both, right? They both give you a more precision. They give you a better representation of what's going on in the football world. And then that leads to the possibility to do more with it, right? Because if I go from just knowing that I'm a dot in two-dimensional space to actually knowing the full context of how my body's moving, right? There's just more you can analyze. I could maybe look at a space when I was in that 2D world, but you can now get down to like the technique of how you're planting your foot and how you're running and how you're rotating your body, like all these things that kind of matter to the game.
And you talked about going into Liverpool and visiting and being impressed with the physicists they had there. Were they particularly interested in tracking data then at an early stage? Were they early adopters of it?
They were early adopters, and I think at this stage now we see all 20 clubs in the Premier League are kind of heavy users of it. But when the technology was a bit more nascent, there's always clubs that are kind of a bit more eager to lean into that, and that's sometimes dictated by who the staff is or what their resources are. But yeah, Liverpool were indeed one of the early ones to invest in this.
Would they actually help you to develop the products? Did it go that far?
Yeah, absolutely. And we kind of take that approach with every club that we work with. We're like, look, we come with a lot of technical expertise and a bit of understanding about the game of football, right? And so then we look at a club and say, you are the absolute world leading practitioners, experts on the game. And so it's kind of our job to show them what's possible of the technology. And then they are often the ones that come to us and kind of have some of the really great ideas of like, what are the practical applications we would like to do that we'd like to go see you go build. And so that's been a really fruitful cycle for us with really every club that we work with in every league across the world, is to say, let us demonstrate some of what's possible with the technology and then come to us with ideas and we will help bring them to life in our set of products.
Yeah. Fantastic. And could this even lead to bigger data science staffs in football clubs, do you think?
I think it likely will. I think there's as you see, the data is now able to touch more and more parts of the club, and there's more and more you can do with it, right? So again, the sports scientists use it to measure physical performance, right? The video analysts use it to automate their video workflows. You have these data science teams now that are managing different parts of the pit. The recruiting group that we talked about, right? Head coaches and assistant managers are using this now as well, and so it can really touch everybody in the club. And so then it creates opportunity for bigger staffs. And we definitely saw that happen in the NBA as well. And when we started in the NBA, 2 or 3 clubs had 1 or 2 people who are working on this in the background. And now you have across all 30 NBA teams, groups of 5, 10, 15 people who are kind of doing this every day.
And we have seen a bit of a correlation, I think, between the teams that are the most successful and the teams with the biggest and best data science staff. So there's probably not a direct correlation, but it's part of the reason that Liverpool and City are so successful, I think, in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were among the clubs that could invest a bit earlier. But I think the other way you can think about this is it kind of creates a new area for competitive advantage, right? So if you are a club that is not at the top of the table or doesn't have the biggest budget, but you want to get really smart about how you deploy technology across your organization, I think it gives you a new place where you can try to find a competitive advantage. And I think particularly in football, I think there's still a lot of opportunity there where it is such a dynamic and flowing game that I think there's a lot more potential of how data can have an impact and evaluate what's going on. But I think there's also further to go than there is in a game like basketball. So it's one of the reasons we're really excited about, the future value we can hopefully bring to the ecosystem.
Have you got any idea why, say, Brentford and Brighton are so good with data? Do you get any insights there?
We get some insights, but I unfortunately am sworn to secrecy. We work with a great deal of discretion with clubs because we know that everything that they're doing internally is kind of their private content. So we try to be very respectful of that and make sure we're only sharing things when they're kind of fully aware of it.
Yeah, definitely. And if people want to find out more about the work of Genius or even about you personally, is there somewhere that they can go?
Yeah, absolutely. Genius Sports is pretty active. Go to to our website. We're active on all the kind of social platforms, Instagram, X, LinkedIn. You can Google Genius IQ. That's our kind of most advanced suite of AI-driven products. And yeah, folks can always feel free to reach out to me directly as well. michael.doria@geniussports.com. And I'm sure we can share that out to all your listeners too. But we love to chat about this stuff. Yeah, we're really trying to promote the deployment of technology in this exciting future, all across sport.
Yeah, brilliant. And you're doing a presentation for our analytics members in July as well, which I'm looking forward to.
That's right. Very much looking forward to that. We'll dive into a bit more detail. We'll have some more visuals and examples, because it's always better to see some of this stuff in action than to just hear me drone on about it. So really, really excited for that event.
Yeah. Well, that's been fascinating. Thank you, Michael. It seems a dry topic perhaps, but I think you've made it very, very interesting, and it definitely has a big impact on the game. So I think it's something that is valuable for people to know about.
Yeah, and really do encourage people to come to that July session, because while it is a bit of a dry and technical topic on the surface, when you actually see some visual examples of what a 3D recreation looks like, how you can automatically augment video and give personalized experiences to fans, I think it really brings it to life and what's possible and really to what we're all going to see in the future of the game in the coming years.
That's great. Thank you so much for your time, Michael.
Thanks, Simon. Really pleasure to be here and appreciate all the work you do.
Everyone is looking for a new edge. To find it, you need fresh perspectives. Our sponsor, Genius Sports, uses advanced AI, unique mesh tracking data, and tactical video to help analysts and coaches see and understand the game from every possible angle. This includes player POVs from the 3D recreation tool that sits within their performance studio, already being used by top clubs in the Premier League, Ligue 1, Pro League, and more. Genius pairs football's most extensive tracking data set ever with multiple automatically synced video angles for the fastest, smartest insights. Join the world's top clubs and find your new edge today. Learn more at www.geniussports.com/TGG.
Thanks very much for joining us on the podcast, Dom.
Pleasure to be here.
And we thought you'd be a fantastic person on this topic because you were Director of Data at Manchester United and also now Chief Data Officer at 12 Football. So you've worked in a club in a very senior position and you're still working with plenty of clubs now.
That's right. And actually, it's been illuminating. So I worked in very big clubs, but also to have worked with clubs across the football spectrum has been a very enjoyable and fulfilling part of my career. To see how clubs operate at all different levels has been great.
And just to start with this topic, we've just heard from Mike Doria from Genius Sports, who worked with Spectrum prior to that. Could you just help us with the difference between event data and tracking data, please, to start with?
Yeah, so event data is probably the simplest form of data that you can collect about a football match, beyond the scores, the scorers, and kind of who got red cards. You can think of it of being the kind of information that you would hear if you were listening to football match on the radio. So who passed the ball to who, whereabouts it is on the pitch, who tackled who, and so on. So you can build up this picture of the ball moving, progressing to the other end of the pitch. So that's event data, and it describes the motion of the ball and the players who interact with it. Tracking data is a kind of step beyond that. The current version of tracking data that typically most clubs would have access to is like the version of Football Manager where you could see the teams and there was a top view of the pitch and you saw the blobs moving around on the pitch and the two colours representing the two teams. So really the best form of tracking data will have a position on the pitch, typically for every frame of a broadcast or of a camera capturing. So 40 to 50 times per second will be updated the position of every player on the pitch. And so you can translate that into a top-down visual of the pitch, which is allows you to look at the spatial and temporal movement, so movement of players across space as time moves forward throughout the match, and the ball, and the referee, and typically, and sometimes even the assistant referees as well.
And we've seen clubs employing some very high-end data scientists in recent years and building their data science teams. Is that because of this tracking data? Would it have still been worth it if it was just event data they were dealing with?
So I think there's still a lot of value to be extracted from event data. I don't think that by any means the value has been extracted, but the reason why tracking data is more valuable to clubs is that you can extract a lot more granular information. I can't remember who it was who said there's only 3%, you're only touching the ball like 1% of the time or 2% of the time, and it's what you do in the other 97% that matters. So with tracking data, you can get a more rounded view of what each individual player is doing when they're not on the ball, and how they're contributing to the team, but also how the team is interacting with itself, so creating space for itself, and how the opposition is trying to limit the amount of penetration that one team can make or exploit the weaknesses in the opposition team. So you can get a lot richer information, but it comes at a cost, which is a very, very much larger amount of information per match. Okay, so event data, somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 rows of information, maybe per match, depending on the provider. But tracking data, as I say, you've got every camera frame of every minute of the match, or every second of the match, right? So that's 40 to 50 frames per second. So for every player, you have information of that level. A significantly higher amount of information, greater amount of information. And therefore, if you're going to collect and process that within your club, you need a different set of skills, right? Which typically don't exist in many football clubs.
So we'd always traditionally heard about analysts within clubs and video analysts, but a data scientist is obviously a different skill set to analyse these large amounts of data.
So there's two. So you really would need, if you're going to do this within a club, you would need a data engineering capability. Data engineering is the skill set which kind of interacts with third-party data providers like Genius, right? So building the systems that ingest the data into a local place where analysts can utilize it. And you will need people who are skilled in storing that data, make sure that data is available and stored correctly, clean, and is available to be used. And then you have data scientists on top of those who actually manipulate the raw data. So that XY tracking data on its own, you can, like if you take event data, for example, you can kind of read it as a story, player A passed to player B, player C passed to player D, and so on. But with tracking data, you have XY positions, coordinates on the pitch. There's just a long list per player, per frame, and that's not really interpretable on its own. There's a significant amount of work to be done to turn that into something which actually then a coach or an analyst can make a decision from.
We're focusing on optical tracking in this podcast, but there are other kinds as well.
Yeah, so the three main kinds of ways in which clubs might access tracking data, from the smallest to the largest. The smallest is kind of wearable technology that is strapped onto each individual player, and that collects not just XY positions but other information from the player as well. But for that, you would only get the data for your own team, so that's used for performance, load monitoring, and so on. The next level is the optical or in-stadium collection of the sort that Genius do, which is cameras or other kind of collection sensors that are installed into stadiums, and multiple cameras or multiple sensors within those stadiums. So you get a kind of 360 view of the pitch, and for that you would get both teams, for example, and often, but not always, depending on the league you're working with, you might have a sharing agreement. So one company might be responsible for collecting and distributing the tracking information for the whole league. That is fairly common in the bigger leagues, but not very common in other leagues. That information, that data, obviously is very high quality, right? Because it has these multiple cameras, and there are very good techniques for distinguishing between players and the location of players on the pitch. It is useful in the sense of you have teams from your league and teams, your team and other teams in your league. But you wouldn't necessarily get a team from other competitions, or if you were scouting players from other competitions, you wouldn't have that same level of information. And so there's a third level, which is very broad, which is data that's derived from broadcast technology. And really that's just like what you see on the TV. There are computer systems that are capable of extracting not only who the individual players are on the pitch, but where they are on the pitch. That's a really interesting problem space, right? There are very significant problems with deriving that from one camera in lots of different stadiums under lots of different conditions. So what you get is a lot more information from a lot more leagues. The quality is variable because of the camera quality. The camera positions are difficult. The lighting conditions can be very, very difficult. And you don't really have any kind of quality control on it because you only have one camera. And also the cameras move, pan back and forth. They're not trying to capture every player on the pitch. So while you get a much broader view of the football pyramid, it's not the same quality as you have from a company like Genius, whose technology is designed to have the highest accuracy within a fixed environment.
And I suppose the big question for this podcast, how do clubs actually use this tracking data?
Yeah, so if we're talking about the optical tracking data specifically, there are probably three main ways in which clubs are using this data. So the first one, and the one that is probably most common within clubs, is within tactical analysis. This can be both pre-match and post-match analysis, but examples of what you can get from tracking data would be identifying the opposition's shape, for example, in different phases of the game. So how does the team set up, in build-up situations, for example, and how do they try and progress the ball forward? How do they move their players around the pitch and manipulate the opposition to try and progress the ball? Now, obviously, that's possible to do from an opposition analyst watching games, but typically opposition analysts will watch maybe 3 games, maybe a handful more, or maybe 4 games of a team, and they will use that to derive their tactical plan, the tactical plan that they're going to employ. Having access to all of the games that a manager has played with different setups of personnel gives you a much richer data set that you can look at for examples of a particular pattern, for example. And so, yeah, you can look at shape, you can look at build-up, you can look at repeatable patterns of play, as I said, you can look at phases of play, so how often the team are in different kinds of blocks and how often they are in different transitional states, how they move between those transitional states. And the object of that is really to try and find those exploitable weaknesses in your opposition, and sometimes, if clubs are sophisticated, to try and identify how the opposition might try and exploit their weaknesses, manipulate them into weaknesses. So that would be the kind of main way pre-match that tracking data would be used. Post-match, you can derive better metrics. So typically teams would have post-match analytics that would involve things like XG, so mathematical models of the game that describe how the game played out, so XT or XG. With tracking data, you can have slightly more sophisticated metrics. So you can look at things like the team's shape in different build-up phases, as I said, and whether or not players stuck to the plan that you'd asked them to stick to. You can look at the distance between the back and the front line, for example, or the horizontal width across the pitch that a team employs. So you can help to teach players by giving them examples after the match of places in which they didn't follow the tactical instructions. And the third way, from a tactical point of view, is in set pieces. So this is actually fairly common, to look at how teams set up for set pieces and how they try and manipulate those situations. So set pieces can be corners, of course, and free kicks, but increasingly the definition of a set piece is extended to any situation where the situation is under complete control of one team. Not how the opposition set up, but how you choose to set up. So obviously that's corner or free kick, but throw-ins is the same. Even kickoffs, right, is I would consider a set piece, and you see some clubs who are more adept at exploiting this kind of thing. figuring out ways to potentially create chances very quickly from those situations. So those are ways in which tracking data has been used within clubs to try and gain an edge.
And I was quite interested in the actual mechanics of this. So I've got a few questions on this. First of all, how do you receive the tracking data as a club? So as a match is ongoing, first of all.
So not every club will have access to in-match tracking data, but most of the companies that produce the data are now capable of turning around from the camera feed into a digital format fairly quickly within less than a minute. It really depends on the kind of company you're working with. But typically what the tracking data provider would do is to provide a message queue. You can subscribe as a club if you have the right capability. You can subscribe to that message queue and then receive the data in a stream. And so this is the same as any kind of streaming information that is more common in other businesses, right? There are plenty of external businesses that apply this kind of thinking to collect information more or less in real time. And this was originally derived from kind of the Internet of Things, which is a term for sensors in the field, in the wild, collecting information and passing it back. And so you might get information from lots of different sources in real time, but not in regular batches or in kind of at regular intervals. It just gets passed back when it's ready. So you would subscribe to that, and then that data is stored in your own internal systems. And if you have the capability, you could, for example, do modeling on that data in real time, in more or less real time. There'll be delay, but more or less real time to give information which could potentially be used in matches. There are practical challenges with doing that, but that whole process requires some fairly sophisticated data engineering technology.
Okay. What would the workflows normally be? Because I think I remember Liverpool saying their workflow would be data scientist to analyst. So we're talking about, say, opposition analysts, then to the coaches. Is that fairly typical, or would the data scientist have a direct interface with the manager?
Well, if you're lucky enough to be working at Liverpool, then you'll have a mature integration of data science into your workflows. That just doesn't exist at lots of clubs, and there might not even really be a distinction between an analyst and a coach at clubs. So you see a lot more often what clubs are looking for is actually, in fact, there was a job advert by Burnley, I think, recently, which actually was very explicit that they wanted somebody who not only could manipulate and process data, but also could contribute to the coaching side. So I think those lines will be blurred significantly over time as more and more younger coaches come through, having had more experience of this kind of technology. But to answer your question, the third-party data that's created, somebody has to set up the system to collect and manipulate it. And what the data scientists, they're not working in real time. They will write code that manipulates that data into information that the analyst can interpret or the coaches can interpret. And so the job of a data scientist in that context is to understand both parts of the equation. So what the data is and what it means and what it can be used for, but also what the analyst or coach, what the decisions they're going to make from having intelligence that's derived from that information and bridging the gap between those two. So you will see within lots of tracking companies that what they are producing is not just the XY data, but they're actually providing quite a bit of that data science. And that would be, let's say, you might have heard the term pitch control models. Okay, so pitch control model essentially divides the pitch up into zones which are under control by one player. Every part of the pitch is kind of reachable by one player quickest, if you see what I mean, depending on where they are on the pitch and which way they're running. So you can sort of split up the pitch into different zones that would tell you which parts of the pitch are under control of individual players, and those parts of the pitch typically then are targets for passes, so for progression. The progression of the ball into those places obviously makes sense, right? Because your player is more likely to reach the ball than the opposition player. So data science would work out that kind of model, then would need to produce something that's useful, because that on its own isn't necessarily useful. Another example would be, you might have heard of the X-pass model, right? So this is where tracking data is quite good, is that it's capable of giving you what in data science terms we call the counterfactual. So the thing that didn't happen, right? If you imagine a pitch situation where a player on the ball has 2 or 3 options for passes and chooses, I'm using air quotes here, the wrong one. With tracking data, you can derive models that say, had that player been capable of making that pass, how dangerous would that have been in terms of the team's ability to go on and score a goal? And so you can create models that say, well, thing 1, how difficult is each of the passes that was available to the player? And thing 2, how dangerous would the situation have been had they been able to make it? And you can use that information to kind of find better players, but also to, potentially for player improvement. Okay, so those models are quite sophisticated and require quite a lot of data science work. And even then, the output isn't necessarily going to be directly interpretable by an analyst or coach. And so at a bigger club, maybe you have a decision science team whose job is not to collect the data and store it and clean it, not to build these sophisticated models that have to work on very large data sets, but actually to produce the information that is usable, in a usable format by coaches and analysts. And that's a kind of third role. If you're talking about a smaller club, well, good luck with that. You'll probably get one person who's doing all of those things, and they might also be the analyst as well. So I think there's going to be a lot more opportunities for people with data skill sets in the future who have that domain knowledge also, who can kind of straddle both those kind of roles, because that kind of process that I described is exactly what you'd find in a business. When I worked in other businesses, that kind of process of getting data from outside the building into the hands of the decision makers in a usable format is pretty mature. In football clubs, much less so.
I think that touches on something I was thinking, actually. In football, there can be a little bit of an us and them, I think, in that the football people, maybe from the playing coaching background, are quite perhaps fearful about data, and they might be listening to this and saying, what a load of nonsense, we need to stick to the basics, the fundamentals. And you can get the flip side as well, where maybe people from a data background are more suspicious of the people with the football coaching playing background. Have you found that the best managers, and you've worked with people like Erik ten Hag, maybe can't talk about too much, but are open to data and adept with it?
I can't really talk about what happened at Manchester United too much, but like Erik in particular was very, very open, and he's just got a new job, right? And at a club that has, I think, got a very mature data function. But he was very open to using data and to the benefits that it could bring. And there are very clear examples where the information which we were able to provide to him as a data science team actually led to very significant victories. So I think it's very clear that data contributed significantly to the successes that we had there. The thing is that if you don't use data, right, then you will be exploitable by people who are using it. So I can't really speak for coaches who don't use data, because I wouldn't have a job there. I wouldn't have a job in that sort of environment. I only have been working with coaches who have wanted to learn more and to understand what the benefit is. And again, I was lucky to work I have been lucky to work in football, but I've also been lucky to work in other businesses where I encountered similar problems of companies that had done things one way. And you have to work hard as a data scientist to show the value, and you have to show the issues with not paying attention to this sort of thing. I can't really say what it would be like trying to work with a coach who didn't use data, but I can say that those coaches will be far less involved in the game in the future, because it's just coming. This is happening. It has happened. the accessibility of data down to, well, essentially all leagues, to almost every professional men's league, to almost every professional women's league, starting to cover almost every aspect of youth football. Technology is only going to get more sophisticated, the ability to collect data. So I know Genius are now providing full body pose estimation, which you're going to be able to derive more different kinds of information from. And if you ignore that at your peril, because that's a revolution that's already happened. Like, you shouldn't be scared of it. Like, you absolutely should not be scared of it, because it's not coming to take people's jobs. It's not coming to take an analyst's job. The best use of data in any business does the heavy lifting to allow the experts to do their jobs more efficiently. And that can do lots. They can find examples of exploitable patterns for you. It can find where players are, need to understand that they are not contributing to the team effort. It can show you where players are running out of steam and you need to make your changes earlier. It can tell you how you might want to change your tactical setup, but it's not going to make those decisions for you in the near term. It's not taking anyone's job. It's just doing a lot of work, fairly dull, tedious work at scale that is useful to you if you embrace it in the right way.
That's a great place to finish. Thank you, Dom.
Oh, what a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to the Training Ground Guru podcast in association with Genius Sports. We'll be back next month with another episode.